Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Philippa Stroud.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all slept well. We're deeply conscious there are some very jet-lagged people out there, but we're delighted to see the room full again this morning and ready to rebuild the foundations of Western civilization. Yesterday was all about the best of our inheritance. And I know many of you were trying to get hold of this book yesterday, and there were problems with the card reader. It is all sorted, so feel free to part with your money today for the best of our inheritance. But today is Choices Day. Today is all about the choices that we face. Whether or not we will continue down a nihilistic pathway, whether or not we'll find a new source of inspiration for our civilization, or whether we will reconnect with the original inspiration of our civilization. To help us on that journey, we commissioned 7 choices papers that you should find in a bag on or near your seat. These are to help equip our thinking as we move forward together. But also to unpack these ideas and themes for us today, we are going to be helped on that journey by Douglas Murray, by Jordan Peterson interviewing Nigel Farage, and then by Ayaan Hirsi Ali telling her own story about the different values of different civilizations around the world. We are in for a real treat this morning. But before we kick off, we just want to look at a short video. Now, this video was actually made for us by Truth Rising. You will have seen their exhibition stand next door. They have been around the world looking at different civilizations. They have been working with numbers of the advisory board of ARC, and we're delighted that they gifted us this video to sum up the choices that we have as we face this moment in our history. Ladies and gentlemen.
The Parthenon, the Colosseum, the Great Pyramid of Giza, Angkor Wat. All the great civilizations in the past can only be found in 3 places. They're in ruins, they're in museums, or they're in history books. Great though they were, they rose and they declined and they fell. In other words, there was what historians call a civilizational moment. Something inspired them and made them the greatness that they were. But at a certain moment in the course of their history, they lost touch with the inspiration and the dynamism that made them what they were. And when that moment came, there are only 3 broad options: renewal of the inspiration, replacement of the inspiration, or decline.
I do think our civilization is at such a tipping point. And I think our options are very limited, but I think we can already see that the alternative fuels that we've tried to put into the great engines of democracy have failed. The great engines really were the Judeo-Christian concepts of accountability to a higher authority, and its resultant sort of individual responsibility coupled with doing the right thing by your neighbour, loving your neighbour. They've been massively diminished. Radical individualism, the new fuel that we've tried to put into the machine, has it coughing and spluttering and looking like it's going to die.
I think we need to decide what exactly our civilization is. Is it just an entertainment? Are we just an audience for a succession of fleeting sensations, sitting on our couches, constantly doom scrolling and changing the channel. If that's what we think civilization is, then I think we'll share the fate of the Romans. We don't communicate the great truths of civilization via emojis.
The West has repudiated the inspiration and the dynamic by which it arose. And many of its greatest ideas, such as human dignity, come from the Bible, the book that made the West. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment, Voltaire, Rousseau, Goethe, Kant, they thought the Enlightenment, which they described in one word as reason, would replace the Christian faith. But 3 centuries later, you can see that while the intellectuals have rejected the Christian faith, the Enlightenment as a replacement has clearly failed. And so there's no question that across the West today, you see people talking about Western decline.
If you sever the civilization from its source, and in our case, the Judeo-Christian foundations, you will no longer see a civilization that is thriving and flourishing. For me, the most extraordinary building block and foundation stone of the West is the extraordinary dignity of every single human being. I mean, that's a profoundly radical thought, that every single human being is of infinite worth. It was the turning point and the foundational building block of everything that we know today. But then laid over that were the principles of freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom to own property. These were the foundational freedoms alongside rule of law, democracy, and we kind of had taken these things for granted.
I do think our civilization is at a tipping point. So the choices are quite binary, quite frankly. We decline like other civilizations, or we need to go and rediscover what our ancestors believed in so deeply when they fought and died and shed so much in the way of sweat and tears to give us what we actually do enjoy today.
So the West is at this civilizational moment and faced with this choice: renewal or replacement or decline.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Douglas Murray.
Thank you and good morning. So good to see all of you here, and thank you to the organizers of ARC for inviting me. Perhaps I could just start by saying that I think that the challenge that Philippa and the organizers of this conference have laid out is much bigger even than we speakers have been told. It's a sort of challenge upon a challenge to be invited to be optimistic about the future from the wastelands of East London. And I'd like to tell all foreign visitors to this conference that if you go just a few miles from this conference center, you'll find a most charming and historical city with many landmarks worth seeing. One of the questions, I think, that all ages ask themselves is, what do they call the age that they are in? Almost every age has had this question. Most recently, the age of modernism asked what comes after modernism, and the rather unoriginal idea was postmodernism. Postmodernism, of course, included its offspring of deconstructionism, and nothing came from that. But I would like to suggest a name for the age that we should be in, and the age that this conference can help bring in: the age of reconstruction. We should be the reconstructionists. The deconstructionists knew something about how to take things apart, but like children with bicycles, had no idea how to put them back together. So it'll be the job of people like those in this room to try to put that civilization back together, and I'm delighted that that's one of the things that we're gathered here to do. I wanted to lay out two broad ideas of what we can do to bring that to pass. First, let me just give an example. Since we are in Britain and there are many Europeans here, I might just make reference to the fact there seems already to be, not in this room, but in Europe, widely a certain contempt for innovations that are occurring in the US, not least at governmental level. There's a whining and a howling about, for instance, Doge's attempts to not just stop government waste, but actually to reform by exposing government waste. One of the great advantages of Doge so far is that you don't only see a way in which a country like America might balance the budget, but in stripping away all of those layers of bureaucracy and budget, you also unveil underneath it the kind of rot that our societies have been willing to put up with along the way. I gather that the administration in DC is looking to do, after USAID, something which was found to be so rotten that it had to be gotten rid of in its entirety, is looking at doing the Department of Education. In America, as in the rest of the West, there is no greater task to do. In New York State, where I spend much of my time, an average spend at a state school is now per pupil around $35,000 a year. For that sum, K through 12 students finish with only just about half of them with basic literacy and half with basic numeracy. So nobody can tell us that money is the problem. Money is not the problem. You could keep throwing money at this problem and you can still create more and more illiterates. So I just wanted to mention briefly the two things I think that can be looked at. The first is, of course, innovation. Again, for those of us in Europe and in Britain, there's an enormous amount to learn, rather than to scorn the American experience. There are reasons why so many of the unicorn startups are from America, why disproportionately they're still from America. There must be something that they're doing right. In this country, we still have a situation where 1 in 5 of the working age population simply do not work, and we, the rest of the taxpayers, subsidize those people not to work. And this seems to me to be a great national scandal, but still something which our governments don't care to address. To my mind, one of the great explanations for this disparity in innovation between Europe and America is a very simple question. It's our attitude towards risk. The idea in America remains that life is indeed risky, that success is risky. And in much of the rest of the West, we've fallen into a kind of complacency, which is a sort of welfarism. When I returned to the UK recently, I discovered that the great debate in the UK was about how to kill the elderly more efficiently. And I was struck that the only argument that any Labour minister could make against euthanasia coming online with the NHS was that she didn't think that the NHS was capable of performing euthanasia efficiently. I mentioned in The Spectator at the time that this was, I think, wrong in one important degree. The NHS is a world leader in killing the elderly. It's just that they only kill the people who don't want to die. The NHS, to which endless governments in this country pour money, is always told to us to be the envy of the world, and yet, of course, none of us can find a GP appointment. But I wanted to mention one other main thing, and to do so, I just want to reflect on something that's been much on my mind in the last couple of years. I spent most of the last couple of years in Ukraine and a much lengthier time in the Middle East covering the wars there. And when I returned to the UK in December, I bumped into a politician friend from Westminster, and I was extolling the virtues of the IDF, with whom I've been embedded for much of the last year in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere. And she said to me, isn't it remarkable that extraordinary events throw up these extraordinary people? I was singing the praises of the amazing young men and women of the IDF as they battle the death cults of Hamas and Hezbollah. And this politician said to me, it is amazing, isn't it, Douglas, that this young generation has stepped up to the challenge, has answered that question of whether or not their generation is fit for the civilizational challenge. And she said, it's extraordinary the way in which events throw up people. And I said to her, there's a tweak we need to do to that analysis, which is it's not just extraordinary events that throw up extraordinary people. It's extraordinary events when they come up against people who have been extraordinarily well cultured. And what I mean by that is that it's not enough that a civilization or a generation comes across a defining moment. It is that when that happens, you know what you're fighting for. It is that you know you're fighting for your faith, for your family, for your people, for your tradition, for your way of life, and very much more. Clever people can sometimes say very stupid things. And in a recent interview, Ayaan Hirsi, who wrote *Sapiens*, was asked if there was any book that he would recommend that people could read in the present to understand the future that's coming, and he said no, he couldn't think of such a book because change was going to be so incredibly fast. And I said a couple of days later at an event in Jerusalem, that's flat out wrong. Change has always happened. And if you want a book to guide you, how about having the book that guided your forebears? Now, to do that, you have to come to the second thing I wanted to mention this morning that you need for civilizational renewal, and that's the ability to look back. To look back. We've wasted so much time in recent years. We've wasted so much time. People have made us move at such a retarded speed. We've had years of talking about the most basic things that our species knew, men and women, what are they? Come on. Who had time for this? Who has... And the problem is that there is a cost to this. There has been a civilizational cost to be made to go at the speed of the slowest kids in the class. Now, one response to the era of mass migration that I've written a great amount has been what I've described as the deculturation of our societies. The idea that in order to welcome people into our societies, we effectively have to pretend that we are uninteresting places, unimportant places until migration makes us interesting. And I just wanted to mention an analogy here, which my friend Eric Weinstein, who's come in today from LA, gave me this idea a while ago. He said, as a boy, he had the impression that ice cream was something whose base flavor was vanilla, and all other flavors were added on top of vanilla. And he said it was only at some point in his youth that he discovered that vanilla itself is a flavor, and a very complex flavor. Now, we in the West have created an extraordinarily complex and rich flavor, and we have spent recent years pretending that we have no flavor, or that flavor is something that only other people bring to us. And this is, of course, flat out wrong, but it's been something that we have told more than one generation of young people in the West. We've told them that we don't really have anything very great, or if we do, we oughtn't to talk about it too much. And I believe that that is flat out wrong, because what we have in cities like that, just a little way up the road, and in the cities of Europe and the West, are the greatest civilization that the world has known. And we have the choice. We have the choice either to live in the wastelands or to rebuild them. Now, there are cities in Europe, I think of cities like Budapest, I think of many German cities, where the idea is that you actually can restore beauty to the built environment, that people do not need to wander like lost souls around the wastelands of East London looking for meaning against buildings that tell them you are nothing, you do not matter. We have the opportunity to restore, not just in the built environment, but in the educational environment, to make sure that when we talk about our culture, we don't just talk about it, but we also do it. For people to realize that our culture is not just something they revere, but something that young people can add to understand the conversation, the poetry of mankind, to understand that just because Mozart is great does not mean you cannot build on Mozart, that just because the great buildings are great does not mean you cannot add to them. I would urge, in the age of reconstruction, that our great task is not just to break through with innovation, but to reclaim what is ours, to say that we love it, and that if people wish to join us in the veneration of this civilization, they are very, very willing to do so. If they don't wish to join us, there are other places they can be. Everybody knows that those of us who revere T.S. Eliot revere him in part because he told us, and indeed tells us still, that a civilization can be reclaimed even at the 11th hour. But even in this hall, I would say that there is another possibility as well, which other philosophers, Strauss and others, also give us, which is the possibility that civilization can also be reclaimed even at the 13th hour, even in the most inauspicious circumstances, and most importantly today, from the most inauspicious of locations. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jordan Peterson and Nigel Farage.
Very good. Ah, excellent.
So we might as well get right to it, I guess. I'm curious about the overlap, or the lack of overlap, I suppose, in the principles that we've been promoting. I've been thinking, for example, some of the success of the convention so far and of our organization has been, well, the positive vision element of what we're promoting. And I guess that's where I'd like to go with you. Yesterday, we had a very interesting panel on energy, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, energy and the environment. Scott Tinker, in particular, has outlined a vision of the future, and it's not a net zero vision, I can tell you that. It's a vision where we cooperate to do everything we possibly can to drive energy prices down as low as they can possibly be, using everything at our disposal, right? Nuclear, coal, gas, oil, solar, wind, whatever can compete, because the most effective way of enriching the absolutely poor and likely of serving long-term environmental needs is to make people wealthy, so they can afford to care about the future, especially in the developing world. And so I'm kind of wondering, you have an opportunity now, because the right is split in the UK, to really hash things out on the Conservative side. And this sort of thing happened a bit in Canada. And that means that it's possible now for Conservatives to push the envelope. And I'm really curious about your view on it isn't exactly even on net zero, which I think is an appalling policy, to get that right out on the table. But more than that, it's like, how appalling is it?
Good morning, everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Old-fashioned upbringing, couldn't help it. First things first, the right is not split in this country. The Conservative Party is not on the right in any measurable way. 14 years that brought us the highest tax burdens since 1947, 14 years that saw mass immigration, legal mass immigration on a scale hitherto never even dreamt of, 14 years that saw illegal immigration, small boats crossing the channel, and the government completely incapable of dealing with it because they couldn't face up to what membership of the European Convention on Human Rights was all about. And 14 years that saw net zero enshrined into law by a Conservative government and Boris Johnson, Theresa May, as evangelical about net zero as the current Ed Miliband. We take the view that if we're going to be using gas, if we're going to be using oil in this country till 2050, and even the most zealous net zero types accept we'll be using these commodities for years to come, our view is if we're going to be using them, we may as well produce them ourselves in our own country and genuinely become energy independent. And our platform is to reindustrialize Britain. We've closed down our steel industry. You know, we think closing down a steel industry is good because it means our national CO2 output is down. And all that happens is the plant closes in Redcar, the plant closes in South Wales, it reopens in India under lower environmental standards, and then the steel is shipped back to us. So let's produce all the stuff we need in this country. Let's become not just energy independent, we could actually become an energy exporter. Right now, every day we import 10 to 15% of our electricity, and our industrial energy prices are between 4 and 6 times higher than America. Not only that, but everybody out there, and of course this hurts the poor more than anybody, we've had 20% subsidies on domestic electricity bills going on now for the best part of 2 decades. And it's a truth that no one dares tell. So look, net zero is a complete and utter disaster. If you want to have energy production that is very, very low in carbon output, there is only one way ahead. That is small, modular, nuclear reactors, dozens of them all over the country. It's the only way forward.
Okay. Well,
it's the only way forward. And you know, if you look at the way the Far East produces nuclear energy, we can do it a damn sight cheaper than we've ever done it before.
Okay. Well, that warms a Canadian's heart. And it's good to get warm in a convention center that's this chilly because of the net zero restrictions. But let me push it a little bit, you know, because we have the opportunity to do that, and I think that it's time. You know, you talked about at least until 2050, and one of the things I've been discussing with my fellow Canadians, let's say, is the fact that, I mean, maybe it's time to stop our obsession with carbon altogether, and so I'm going to say something relatively radical, and well, let's just play this out and see how it goes. So, you know, I've reviewed a lot of scientific papers. Now, they're not climate papers, but I'm a reasonable hand at separating the wheat from the chaff on the scientific front. And when I look at the carbon data, there is one fact that leaps out to me in my experience with scientific data is that there's usually 1 or 2 major facts and a bunch of trivial sub-facts that more or less you can ignore. As far as I can tell, the most stunning effect of carbon, atmospheric carbon, that has been recorded scientifically is the effect of carbon on plant growth. Right. And we know this. Look, in the last 25 years, thereabouts, 20% of the Earth's surface is greened. 20% is a lot. It's a lot. It's an area equivalent to twice the size of the continental US. So that gives you a quick picture of scale. And it's also primarily greened in semi-arid areas, because when you give plants more carbon dioxide, they're stomata-closed, and so they can live where it's drier. And so the deserts are shrinking, not growing, which is exactly the opposite of what we were told was going to happen. And crop yields are up, something approximating 10 to 13%. So that's not bad, that's good. And so I'm afraid that even throwing the dog a bone, let's say, and saying, well, we're certainly not going to hit our 2030 targets because they were proposed by buffoons and liars. We're not going to hit our 2050 targets either. I'm dead serious. This is not good. And so I'm curious about how far this needs to be taken. I have because I also think, conceivably, that the environmentalist climate scam was really an offshoot of the Club of Rome Malthusian stupidity that is predicated on the presumption that resources are finite and that there's far too many people on the planet, and there's a terrible anti-human motivation lurking underneath all of that that's pessimistic and brutal and genocidal in its fundamental ethos. And I think it's kind of time for people who would like energy to be inexpensive and reliable and there for the poor to just end it. It's like no more carbon apocalypse mongering and terrorizing. And so I guess I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, the one thing that drives me absolutely potty is when I hear that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. That's what they tell us. That clearly is absolutely nuts. Now, there are times in our past when CO2 in the atmosphere has been much, much higher than it is today, and that's before people drove 4x4 Chelsea tractors. And I remember having this debate about 20 years ago. There was a man called Sir Patrick Moore.
Yes.
Very famous scientist, The Sky at Night, great character, very respected man. And I said to him about 20 years ago, I said, Patrick, what do you think about man's impact on the environment through CO2? He said, well, it's impossible to think man doesn't have some sort of impact. He said, but when it comes to carbon dioxide levels and when it comes to warming and cooling, he said, let me assure you that sunspot activity and underwater volcanic activity will always have a bigger impact on the environment than man himself ever can, and I very much stuck to that view. So I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you whether CO2 is leading to warming or not, but there are so many other massive factors. And Jordan, I was told that of all the CO2 that's produced every year in the world, only 3 to 5% of it is produced by mankind. So we do, as you rightly say, need to get this debate into a sense of perspective. And I sometimes think that the carbon dioxide hysteria has actually blinded us to other environmental disasters that are going on, such as the rape of our oceans and many other things. I'm an environmentalist in the old school sense and definition of that term. A bit more common sense, that's what we need.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to harass you about one other issue too. I think we'll focus on 2 out of our 5 platforms. So the principle that we've founded ourselves on that actually produced the most internal dissent in our organization was our family policy. Now, I spent a fair bit of time speaking with authorities in Hungary about their family policy. Hungary spends a substantial amount of their GDP on family policy. It's 7%. They were concerned about a variety of issues. High rate of abortion, high rate of divorce, low rate of female participation in the workforce, which is kind of a strange addition to that group, but that was still a concern, and extremely low birth rate. And so they made it a priority to address those, and they've had some success reducing abortion, which is still legal in Hungary, substantively, reducing the divorce rate, flattening the decline in the birth rate. They haven't managed to pop it up again. Only Israel has managed that, by the way, and it's not exactly obvious why. And we argued this out amongst the ARC members, and our consensus by the end was that the core of civilization, as such, and the Western civilization that we're attempting to reinvigorate, let's say, is, first of all, a circle of tolerance, okay? So we'll make that the a priori axiom, but then a commitment to long-term, stable, married, monogamous, heterosexual, child-centered marriages. And so now that's a fairly restrictive ideal. You know, ideals are restrictive. And, you know, we're all cognizant of the fact that within our own families, for example, 40% of our siblings, let's say, are likely to be divorced, that there's no shortage of single mothers, that homosexuality and homosexual couples exist, and that there's going to be deviations from the norm. But I'm curious, again, like in your view, you know, you could make the case that that stable, committed monogamy, heterosexual, child-centered monogamy, is the kind of long-term commitment to community, to sacrifice, and to future that's the fundamental unit of civilized society. And so I'm curious, Mike, what do you think about that?
Well, I may not necessarily be the best advocate for monogamous heterosexuality or stable marriage,
yep,
having been divorced twice.
Yep.
But do I think family matters? Jordan, on the 3rd of June last year, as I was coming into London by car to go back into politics, you know, having left it a few years before, my ambition was to get the United Kingdom to be a self-governing, independent nation. And for many, many years, I was pretty much on my own fighting that battle. The day we left the European Union, I thought, right, I've done my job. And that day on the 3rd of June, when I was coming back, thinking, well, you know, this really rather comfortable, lovely life I've got is about to disappear, I thought, why am I doing it? And I came up with 3 words: family, community, and country. They're the things that matter to me above absolutely everything. And I have tried, in difficult circumstances, I've tried to make sure with both ex-wives that our children have had as stable an upbringing, given the circumstances, as they can possibly have. I think part of this, and this is important, about who we are as a country and who the West is, we've kind of forgotten that what underpins everything is our Judeo-Christian culture. And that's where we need to start. That's where we need to start. And if we recognize that, and if we value that, then I think everything comes from that. So yes, of course, family matters enormously. Of course, we need higher birth rates. But we're not going to get higher birth rates in this country until we can get some sense of optimism. And we need a complete 180 shift in attitudes. We've got to start telling young kids that hard work is good, that success is good, that there are no shortcuts in life, that making money is good. And what I see is we sort of disincentivize young people, and to think that another 1 million young people since the start of the pandemic are on disability benefits because they're suffering from depression and the doctors sign them off. We need some very, very big cultural changes. We've got to get that spirit, that sense of optimism back in the country. We had it in the late 1980s. We actually had it through much of the 1990s. That's what we have to recapture. And frankly, being led as we are by, I mean, God, doesn't Rachel Reeves just make you want to reach for the cry tissues? I mean, it's all so miserable. It's all so declinist. Frankly, the Conservatives have been no better. We need a change of attitude in Britain. And if we get that right, people will have more kids.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was short and sweet, and there's obviously many other issues that we could discuss, and no doubt will, but I would like to thank you very much for coming and talking to us today, and to letting me harass you about these issues. It's very good to talk to you, sir.
Thank you, George.
Yeah, good luck. Thank you, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to be back with you, those of you who were here last year, 1,500 strong, and welcome to those of you who are attending this conference for the first time. This year, it's 4,150. Congratulations to Philippa, and to Jordan, and to everyone else who made this happen. I want to begin with a simple point. This event has been organized by an Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. But citizenship implies a distinct political entity. For most of the modern era, that entity was called the nation-state. Modern liberals trashed the nation-state and nationalism, invoking Hitler and Mussolini, and arguing that nationalism had caused World War II, not to mention the Holocaust. They failed to make a distinction between bad nationalism and good nationalism. They also underplayed the role of socialism, collectivism, as well as racial theories of fascism. The old liberals of the 19th century had passionately believed in the nation-state and saw it as indispensable for responsible citizenship. The modern liberals disagreed. Who are these modern liberals I'm referring to? Many were not liberals at all, in the sense that John Stuart Mill would have understood them. Some were really social democrats, well to the left of true liberalism. Some were tenured intellectuals who transformed the modern university into a place for brainwashing young minds into hating their national identity and history. Some were the editors in charge of legacy media whose focus in the past 50 years seems to have been to undermine the national institutions. Some worked as activists within the web of think tanks and NGOs. And finally, some ran the administrative state, the bloated bureaucracy that has come to see itself as the benign guardian against fascism while routinely suppressing liberty. What was it that they wanted to replace the nation-state with? The radical pursuit of heterogeneity in the name of multiculturalism and diversity, international and supranational entities designed to transcend or sidestep the nation-state, such as the United Nations or the European Union. Some even dreamt of world government, the globalists. There were other alternatives to the nation-state too. For example, Islamists argued and continue to do so that the caliphate should be restored and Sharia law imposed. But these visions of a post-national world are delusional. The international and supranational bodies turned out to be dysfunctional, tyrannical rule of bureaucracy, and wasteful, chronically prone to fraud and abuse. The experiment, based on the bogus theory of multiculturalism, prone to bring about heterogeneous societies in Europe, has in large measure failed. As for the Islamist states, as we've seen, all the territories snatched and governed by jihadi insurgents are ghastly hellscapes. The only habitat worse than a Hobbesian state was the Islamic State, where life was even nastier, more brutal, and shorter. So part of my message to you today is simple. Stop the post-national experiment. It has already gone too far. Rubio, the rules-based international order, not the new Secretary of State, is over. From 1945 to, say, 2014, it had a good run, roughly 70 years. But let's face it, most of that period was the Cold War, from around 1948 until 1989. But the post-Cold War period, or shall we call it interbellum 2.0, is over. Maybe it came to an end on the 20th of January 2025. Or maybe it ended long before that when the Syrian dictator used chemical weapons in 2013, or when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. But it's over, which means we can bid farewell to 2 or 3 decades of uncertainty. Uncertainty of identity, uncertainty of morality, and uncertainty of purpose. Decades of delusion. Now we can see clearly there is no better model than the nation state. The good news is that the proponents of a post-national global order are cast out into the political wilderness in America. The Democratic Party today cannot adopt the "let's sit this one out until 2028 and everything will be okay" posture of 2016. They have, number one, no clear leadership to help the party navigate its way out of the mess they have put themselves in. All the clever Democrats are now serving in or supporting the Trump administration. Number two, they have no funding. The big donors have moved on, especially after Kamala Harris's profligate campaign. Number three, they have no media monopoly. And it's not only X, formerly Twitter. There is a forest of new media, and most of that is right of center and beyond. Number four, they have no control of government, especially through the bureaucracy and intelligence communities. In fact, all DEI hires are being actively dodged from various agencies. Most important of all, their globalist message was rejected in favor of the America First agenda. In short, they have no power. And that is good news. It means Americans have a better chance of achieving the mission of this conference, which is to restore responsible citizenship. For me, responsible citizenship means the restoration of a healthy nationalism. That's the preeminence of national sovereignty, loyalty to a shared national identity, and citizenship defined as allegiance to the nation state. It's fidelity to the Constitution or to the foundational principles and mythos of the nation, to the idea that all citizens are equal before the law, that we all have the same rights and obligations, that justice is blind, that we are all innocent of any crime until proven guilty, that the government is limited and constrained by law, and it's there to protect these things. But I have one more point to add, and it's the most important point of all. The nation state also needs Christian morality, or in the case of Israel, the morality of the Torah. In Europe, Christianity remains, despite decades of secularization, the crucial operating system of society. Without it, the apps don't work. When I came to Europe in 1992, fleeing a forced marriage that was part of a failed clan system, this was the type of nation-state that I found. Wealthy, peaceful, stable, and optimistic, but still rooted in the Calvinist and Catholic traditions. I had left the chaos of Somalia and other African nations where I had lived, where tribal, ethnic, and religious conflict had made it impossible to develop a healthy nationalism. What I found in Holland was truly inspiring to me. I found the same inspiration when I first went to the United States. But in the past 16 or so years, I have seen on both sides of the Atlantic a sustained effort to drive Christianity to the margins of our society. I believe this gamble on secularism will go terribly wrong. It already has. Every successful nation has to be based on more than a constitution and a body of law. There must be transcendental stories that unites citizens to an ethical as well as legal code. For the West, that was the Judeo-Christian story of the Bible. The biblical understanding of human sinfulness inspired the concept of limited state power or rule of law, emphasizing checks and balances to prevent tyranny, Isaiah 33:22. Governments are seen as instruments to maintain order and justice, but not as ultimate authorities. The belief that all humans are created in God's image, Genesis 1:27, underpins ideas of equal worth, human rights, and dignity for all individuals, including the poor and the neglected. Biblical teachings such as love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18, emphasizes care for others and fairness in governance. The Bible's distinction between God's sovereignty and earthly authority, Matthew 22:21, influenced the Western principle that the state should not overreach into matters of faith and conscience. Biblical ethics stress that rulers and citizens are accountable to a higher moral law, ensuring that government acts justly and protects the vulnerable, Romans 13:3-4. These principles collectively shaped Western values like democracy, human rights, and constitutional government. That is why my message to you today, and the message of Courage.media, is to stress that responsible citizenship in the West is inseparable from Christian morality. Please, let's aspire to build or restore the nation states on which our security depends. And let's ensure that they run as they used to on that Christian operating system without which we can have no moral compass. Thank you.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, to continue this theme of the choices that we face, we have our next speaker who is going to speak to us, followed by a panel of John Anderson, Rod Dreher, Amy Ewing, and Neil Ferguson. Fresh on the plane, off the plane, only just made it through the door, David Brooks.
So I have a confession to make. I'm a member of the educated elite. My parents were historians of Victorian England. Our turtles, when I was growing up, were named Disraeli and Gladstone. The culture in our home was think Yiddish, act British. Very stiff upper lip, we showed no emotion. And then when I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided I wanted to become a writer. And that was central to my identity ever since in high school, which you call like fourth form or something like that. I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so those were my values. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown universities decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And some of you may know the saying about Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. My favorite saying about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so it's very educated elite, and I fit right in. I had a double major at Chicago in history and celibacy while I was there. And then after school, I got a job where an educated elite person should get a job. I was hired to be the conservative columnist of the New York Times, a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And then I got a job on PBS, which is our PBS NewsHour, which is our version of Newsnight. And again, educated elite. We have a wonderful audience, somewhat seasoned. And so if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me at the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your program, but my mother loves it. So we members of the educated elite did some good things. We created the internet brunch and mocktails. You're welcome. We did some bad things. We designed a meritocracy designed around the skills we ourselves possess and rigged the game so we succeeded and everybody else failed. By age 12, American children of affluent kids are 4 grade levels above everybody else. By university age, rich kids are 77 times more likely to go to university or to Ivy League university than kids from poor schools. In adulthood, 54% of the people at elite workplaces went to the same 34 elite colleges. So we ended up creating a caste system. People with high school degrees die 9 years sooner than people with college degrees. People with high school degrees are 5 times more likely to have kids out of wedlock. People with high school degrees are 2.4 times more likely to say they have no friends. So we created a caste system, even though we pretend to be egalitarian. But the worst things we did were not material. America has a very strong economy. The worst things we did were spiritual. We privatized morality and destroyed the moral order. George Marsden is a great historian who said, what gave Martin Luther King's rhetoric its power was the sense there's a moral order built into the universe. That if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. If segregation is not wrong, nothing is wrong. We took that essential moral order that holds people together, and we decided it's up to you to find your own truth, find your own values. Back in 1955, a great American journalist named Walter Lippmann understood this was going to be a big problem. He said, if what is right and wrong depends on what each individual feels, then we are outside the bounds of civilization. And so, without a strong moral order, it's hard to have trust. It's hard to find your meaning in life. And so America, and I think Britain too, has become a sadder society. Rise in mental health, rise in suicide. 45% of high school students say they are persistently hopeless and despondent. Since 2000, the number of Americans without close personal friends is up by 4-fold. Since 2000, the number of people who say they are in the lowest happiness category is up by 50%. We've just become sadder. The third thing the educated elite has done, and this may not please you, is we produced Donald Trump. Some people think Donald Trump is a populist. Donald Trump and Elon Musk went to the University of Pennsylvania and Ivy League school and became billionaires. J.D. Vance went to Yale. Pete Hegseth went to Princeton and Yale. Stephen Miller went to Duke. Fox News types like Laura Ingraham went to Dartmouth. And they represent the educated elite. And the key factor of the educated elite is that they're not pro-conservative, they're anti-left. They don't have a positive vision, a conservative vision for society. They just want to destroy the institutions that the left now dominates. And this means, in the first place, they're astoundingly incompetent. I have a lot of sympathy with what drove people to vote for Trump, But I'm telling you, as someone who's on the front row to what's happening, do not hitch your wagon to that star. Thank you. You're supposed to boo. Pete Hegseth gave away our bargaining chips with Putin before we even had negotiations. Elon Musk has 25-year-olds firing people who are controlling our nuclear codes. It's like Sam Bankman-Fried got control of our nuclear arsenal. Second, elite narcissism causes them to eviscerate every belief system they touch. Conservatives believe in healthy societies are built on healthy institutions. They're anti-institutionals. Conservatives believe in steady and gradual change, Edmund Burke. They're disruption. Conservatives believe in constitutional government. Donald Trump says, I alone can fix this. Conservatives believe in moral norms. They're destroying moral norms. The other belief system that they are destroying is Judeo-Christian faith. Judeo-Christian faith is based on service to the poor, service to the immigrant, service to the stranger. I went to Namibia, South Africa throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and I watched people die of AIDS. Then I went back with my friend Mike Gerson, and I saw those 25 million lives saved. I saw people living lives of dignity. And so what's the first thing Donald Trump did? He eviscerated that program. My friends in America are conservative evangelicals in government who want to fight sex trafficking, poverty. They want to preserve national security. Donald Trump is declaring war on those Christians. So So I've described three different things we educated elites brought you. We destroyed the social fabric through inequality. We destroyed the moral fabric through privatizing morality. And we destroyed the institutional fabric, what's happening right now. How can we come back? Well, we already are. I often ask people, tell me about a time that made you who you are as a human being. And they never say, I went on a fantastic vacation in Hawaii. They never say that. They say, I went through a really hard time. The death of someone, the loss of someone, moving away from home, entering a new vocation. Paul Tillich, the theologian, said those moments of suffering interrupt your life and they remind you you're not the person you thought they were. They carve through the floor of your basement of your soul and they reveal a cavity below, and they carve through that floor and they reveal a cavity below. In moments of suffering, you see yourself in a more deep way than you ever did before. And in those moments of suffering, you can either be broken or you can be broken open. And people who are transformed decide, I'm going to be broken open. And nations that are going to be transformed by moments of suffering say, we're going to be broken open. We've been through periods of national crisis before. Across the world, nations have constantly hit a spiritual and cultural crisis and then revived. This country between 1820 and 1848. I was here in the 1980s. Britain recovered in the 1980s. Australia in the 1970s, Germany and Japan after World War II, South Korea in the 1980s, Rwanda after 1994, Chile in the 1990s. My own country, we've done this again and again. We've grown not through a happy, merry ride. We've grown through a process of rupture and repair when society and culture is in crisis and we figure it out. 1770s, the old colonial order had to go. Sorry. 1830s, the East Coast elite had too much power. Andrew Jackson brought in an era of populism. 1860s, the slavery order had to go. Abraham Lincoln brought forth national redemption. 1890s, we had failed at industrialization. We had a civic renaissance of all these civic organizations that filled in the hole and created a sane society. 1960s, the conformist culture of the 1950s had to go. And we had the changes that came there. The temptation of those who don't read history is to think this time is different. We're in another period of rupture and repair. We have spiritual resources. I'm a conservative. I believe that we are inheritors of a great spiritual legacy, what Michael Oakeshott called the Great Conversation. We have the voice of Genesis, that we're all made in God's image. That's the foundation of democracy. We have the voice of Exodus, that we wander through the wilderness and eventually get to the promised land. We have the voice of Jesus, even if you're not Christian, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's a source of great strength. In my country, we have the voice of Alexander Hamilton. Poor boys and girls should rise and succeed. We have the voice of Edmund Burke. That we should be modest about what we can know because culture is really complicated and we should operate on society the way we would operate on our father, gradually and carefully. We have the voice of John Stuart Mill. We value diversity and pluralism because it leads to what he called adventures in living. When you have a spiritual, moral, and relational crisis, the job is to shift the culture. And we are moving, I think, from a hyper-individualistic culture the last 60 years toward a communal culture. I didn't like the social justice movement, but it was an attempt to find community. I'm not particularly a big fan of MAGA, but it's an attempt to find community. Culture change is about a shifting of the heart. It's about providing new answers to the question, how should I live my life? It's about soulcraft. And it isn't done the way you do political change. Culture change works differently. It's done, as Walter Bagehot put it, if you want to win people over, enjoy the things that conservatives enjoy. Culture changes when a creative minority find a beautiful way to live. Culture changes when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy. That's the story of the early church. It's the story of the Clapham sect. They weren't my cup of tea, but it's the story of Bloomsbury. I was mentored by William F. Buckley. It's the story of the conservative movement in America. Culture changes on a personal level. When we relate to each other with attentive and generous gaze. Simone Weil said, attention is the purest form of generosity. Culture changes on a spiritual level. T.S. Eliot said, you can't create a system so perfect that the people in it don't have to be good. It's when you put moral formation at the center of your society. And finally, it happens at the civic level. When 1,000 voices and 1,000 different organizations create civic institutions that provide healing and relationship in society. That's how culture changes. I was at a bar about 2 months after October 7th. And if you had seen me there, you would have thought, sad guy drinking alone. I call it reporting. So I'm scrolling through Twitter, and it has all these brutal images from the Middle East. But I come across a video of James Baldwin. And he says, you know, there isn't as much humanity as one would like, but there's enough. And what you've got to remember is that when you walk down the street, every person you meet, you could be that person. That could be you. You could be that monster. You could be that saint. And you have to decide who you're going to be. Now, James Baldwin was treated shabbily by my society because of his race and other things. But he had a right to be bitter. But even in that circumstance, he uttered the ultimate humanist statement. You could be that person could be you. And the phrase that rang in my head when I heard that was defiant humanism. That even in harsh and brutal times, we're called upon to see each other in the fullest, deepest, and most respectful way that God imagined that they would be seen. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to bring out John Anderson, Neil Ferguson, Amy Orr-Ewing, and Roger Eyre, assuming they show up. They're boycotting me. Okay, I will now ask myself questions. Oh, here they are.
I guess you're off J.D. Vance's Christmas card.
That happened long ago. Neil, we're going to start with you. You're the historian of the bunch. Talk about national uplift, times countries have revived themselves, times offer us some hope.
Well, David, I enjoyed your comments, and of course I'm obliged to say that I enjoyed my wife's comments even more. And my fellow Scotsman, Douglas Murray, was good too. And he's always brilliant. As I listened to these three outstanding speeches, which touched on morality, on God and how culture changes, I kept reflecting on the role that war has played in the past in causing national resurgences and national collapses. And your thoughts, your remarks, put me in mind of Tolstoy. Tolstoy's War and Peace is the story of ordinary people trying to live their private lives, and they have their private lives turned upside down by war. And that has been the experience of friends of mine in Israel. It has been the experience of friends of mine in Ukraine. But for most people in this auditorium, in this country, and in the United States, that's a very distant, remote experience. I have to think back to my grandfathers to understand what it's like for war to strike at the very heart of Britain. And you have the same. So a lot of what we talk about in these contexts is, from a historian's point of view, detached from the reality that it's very often the shock of war that brings about the biggest transformations, revivals or collapses of national culture. So that's the thing that sometimes gets left out of these conversations in the United States. You spoke semi-ironically, disparagingly about American elites. But American elites helped win World War II. It was American elites who built the capabilities that defeated the dark forces of National Socialism. And it was British elites who also contributed to that great victory in 1945. So let's remember, before we slag off the elites, that they played a key part in preserving Western civilization. I'll say one more thing. When I'm trying to educate my children, who are even further away than I am from that experience of conflict, of war and peace, I try to get them to read the literature that will inform them of that searing experience. And if you can't get them to read the literature, then at least get them to watch Rogue Heroes, SAS, one of the best television series I've seen in ages. And the spirit of David Sterling I find terribly uplifting. That spirit that created the special forces, the spirit that said, we're simply going to break the rules and get in behind the enemy lines and completely bugger up the way they fight this war. It's terribly inspiring to be reminded that we British, indeed we Scots, came up with the completely mad idea of the SAS. But that's the spirit, the real spirit of Western civilization that will never, I think, die as long as we remember that our civilization was built in the crucible of war.
Okay. Amy, what are the spiritual resources we have that you see to tap into?
I think we're living at a time of real spiritual thirst in the West. The studies suggest that Generation Z are much more likely to be spiritual and open to the idea of God than their parents. And I think the Judeo-Christian worldview has two really powerful and wonderful things to offer this generation that have sustained our civilization. The first we've talked about a lot at the conference, the idea of being created in the image of God. God within the Bible is not an idea. God is in actuality a person. And so to be created in the image of God is to have extraordinary dignity and value. And that, to a generation that have been raised being told your identity is, dependent on yourself, you have to generate it yourself, and your identity is defined by intersectional injustice, and then you're propelled by grievance into this world. What a contrast to view yourself and other human beings as sacred image bearers of a living God who we can have connection with. And I think the second most powerful idea is the idea of redemption, the possibility of grace and a second chance, the possibility of forgiveness. My grandparents came to this country in 1948, escaping Soviet occupation. They landed with my father and my aunt at RAF Northolt in the clothes they were standing up in. They had experienced the horrors of the Nazis and then of the Soviets. As a generation, they knew the reality of evil, the darkness in the human heart potentially. The Bible talks about the fall as a real category. So we've been created in the image of God, but every single person also is wrestling with sin and darkness. And so what the Judeo-Christian framework gives us is this possibility of redemption, a new start, a fresh start. And that isn't just about an individual connection with our Creator, although it is about that, and what a wonderful way to live, with attachment to a loving God as the core of our being. But it also propels people's lives for good. You know, the parable that Jesus is most famous for, the Good Samaritan, is cited all the time as a kind of example of why we should do good and love our neighbour. But the earliest thinkers in the church, the patristic writers, realized that the central character of the Good Samaritan was Jesus himself. And what he was essentially saying is to be human is to feel like being beaten up and left at the side of the road to die. And we all need rescue, we need forgiveness, we need deliverance, we need help from outside, we need redemption. And once we've experienced that, we can rebuild our world. We can love neighbour. We can do prison reform. We can care for the poorest. We can create systems that reflect a loving God and the value of every human being created in his image. And all of us have the possibility of a second chance. Businesses, when we fail, we can get up and start again. We can create wealth through this power of redemption and forgiveness.
Okay, thank you. Rod and I have been friends for years. We disagree about Donald Trump. We disagree about J.D. Vance. We probably disagree about Viktor Orban. But
yeah, I think
the friendship we have is one of the ones I value because of that disagreement. Your books, going back to the Dante book, Benedict option, the current book on enchantment, they're part cultural critique, but really the things I found personally most valuable is spiritual uplift and a spiritual path. So if I could ask you to talk about that part of your work.
Yeah, my work in recent years has been about trying to save civilization, broadly considered, but the meaning crisis is at the heart of of our civilizational struggle, and the meaning crisis is ultimately